Hey y'all, it's Karen. So I wanted to come to you today for the second time. My first video was today in the park, but I wanted to talk to you, follow up with you about what's going on with all these protests. And I might actually make another video, a third video. I don't want to talk to you guys too long, so I want to break these up a little bit. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the protest. And the second thing is about repatriation. So following up with the Facebook post. So number one, I think, just to get to the point, that this is being done to appease people because the rioting, unfortunately, was effective. Just like it was in the 60s, that when these folks lose property, money, and they fear that for their own safety, that's when they really respond. Unfortunately, that's the way that it always is. And I know the peace-loving and the, most of us are, right? Peace-loving and we like order. And this chaos is scary. Most of us feel that way, right? So we don't want this happening. The writing seems outrageous to us, but unfortunately it has been effective. The other thing that I wanted to say was just to follow up on these two groups and what's going on here. So as we know, this probably is going to be pinned on African Americans. A lot of people are saying that when they watch the mainstream news, which I don't watch a lot of, what's going on is that depending on what channel you're watching, like Fox News, for example, they're just showing the black protesters. So it looks like black people are behind all of this destruction. Well, what's really going on, and I was watching something else, I might post it. I might not, because I like what the guy has to say about race, but he's really homophobic in these ways that are really kind of ugly and not cool, and I don't really want to put that out in the world. So anyway, he does say something that's really important about race. He talked about in Ferguson, what happened was that, these white college students showed up, these protesters showed up, and they were throwing Molotov cocktails, and they were throwing them, sort of into these businesses. And the local people were saying, look, those are black businesses. You don't want to throw it there. And they kind of insisted, right? They were throwing these cocktails and these homemade bombs they were firebombing these black-owned businesses. And they said they were actually going into the heart of the black business district and destroying the black-owned businesses. So fast forward, it was just a conversation about how that seemed now to be intentional, and that's probably what's going on here. I think there's an economic reason for that. So as I go out through Harlem, I went out today and I went for a walk, and I was out for several hours, and I kind of walked around, and there are a lot of businesses that are boarded up and a lot of businesses that won't be coming back. And a lot of people are leaving this city. A lot of people are getting out of New York, getting out of Manhattan. And I think that what's going to happen is that it's going to drive the real estate prices down. And a lot of black people who have been entrenched here, who were not selling and leaving and turning over the community, now are going to be forced to leave because they don't have the capital to stay, which means that it's going to hasten gentrification in Harlem. And I think, when this is all said and done and New York comes back, if it comes back, it's not going to look the same, right? It's going to be very different, and it's going to no longer be a majority black neighborhood. So that's one thing. The other thing is, again, we're in the middle of a war between the white left and the white right, and they're using us to fight that war out. And I think it's just in our best interest to understand that and not get in the way. So I'm going to say this too. I think it is the nature of the people that we're dealing with to cause chaos and confusion and destruction, and then go in and fix it. So all of us can then say, look, they're so organized and they're genius, and look how they build and create things. But we forget that they're usually the people that cause the chaos in the first place. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing them, cause their own chaos, and then they'll fix it, and then, we will be mesmerized, right? So anyway, I just remember, it's so funny that I'm likening that to sort of somebody that I used to work with in my last job. She would totally do that. She literally would go in and cause a problem, and then she would have the solution, or she would know that there wasn't a way to fix it. She'd tie your hands so you couldn't fix it, and then she would go in and save the day, right? And it would impress everybody around her who didn't realize that she was the person that caused the problem in the first place. So it was a good way for her to stay relevant and to stay there and to look like, she was a go-to problem-solving person. So anyway, I kind of feel like, she's just an example, a microcosm really, right? As an individual of what the folks that we were dealing with actually do. So anyway, on a larger scale, they actually kind of operate this way. So anyway, that's what's going to happen to, I think, New York, and it's probably going to happen in a lot of major downtown areas where, these folks abandoned these places a long time ago and they want them back, and it's a way to sort of clean house and get us all out. Well, while we're getting out, I hope a lot of you, if you are business owners, if you know business owners, that, people are applying for the PPP loans. I don't think the SBA money is there's not going to be any more SBA money, but if there's anything that's out there, please follow some of these YouTubers that are talking about things. Also, I'm not a big fan of Roland Martin, but I got really fortunate. I don't really sleep a lot, and I'm up late, as some of you can see. And I was up one night, I was watching Roland Martin, and he had this guy, this African-American guy, who was one of the people that helped form this plan to the recovery plan, or the stimulus package, or whatever they call it, right? So it worked out well in my favor. I kind of stayed up all night, did my taxes over the weekend, and submitted everything, and now it's all starting to sort of roll in. So if they do a second round, please, please, please make sure that you watch, and that if you are a business owner, you respond quickly. Do not take your time, do not pass go, get your taxes done and submit your paperwork, right? Anyway, that's what I have to say about all of the stuff with the protests and the rest of that. Oh, I didn't want to add that, so we'll see what happens with these guys and these charges and what they do with that, if they do the right thing or not. I don't have a lot of faith in it, because there's a balance in here. They're trying to keep the racist white people happy. They're keeping them from tearing up and shooting up the country, and keep us from rioting, right? And tearing everything up. So anyway, we'll see what happens and who it is that they're going to cater to ultimately. But I'm not really hopeful, and not in this. I'm hopeful in other things. So now I'm going to skip over to what I actually am hopeful about. So if any of you guys have been paying attention, I've been going back and forth to Africa since 2013. I've made 5 trips. I've been to 3 countries so far, and there's many more places that I'm going to visit. It's my plan. But I've picked a country. I've talked about it before. I'm not going to get into that in this post. But, sooner rather than later, I should be making a permanent move. And my plan is to go there and actually start a business. So for people who are like, oh my God, this sounds crazy for someone just to pick up and move to Africa, you want to think about it this way, that you don't necessarily have to pick up and move all at once, but go and visit. There are 55 countries, and you can find your flavor, right? There is huge diversity of cultures and people. I decided that, after going to East Africa, that I'm an East Africa girl. I'm kind of laid back, and people are kind of kind, and, really kind of gentle and pretty honest, I think, for the most part. Like, some people try to get over a little bit, but, you kind of push back a little bit, and that all falls apart. And then also, people are really helpful, and there's a sense of community, and people are very kind. And then also, I'll say this too, as an African American, or a Black person in the diaspora, an African in the diaspora, that when you go there, there is a really high esteem that we're held in. We don't really get this here, and I want to talk about that a bit and the reason why that is. So I'm going to get into a little more of my personal beliefs that, I hate to say this, right? Because as a recovering bougie Black person, I'm implicated in this, right? I'm being raised by people who are strivers. So, my folks, came from the hood, and, one of them had a little more than the other one, but, they didn't have a lot, like a lot of African Americans, but they worked really hard, right? My dad was a pretty smart guy, and, he went to college and grad school a couple times. He's got a couple graduate degrees that, they moved us out to the suburbs, but we were never, they were interesting, right? So as they moved us out there, they saw the hustle. They were just like, yeah, we live here, but we're here, but we're not of it. So don't start thinking that you're white. Don't forget what it means to be Black, and don't forget that you have an obligation to your community, right? So the idea that your community first, an idea that you don't disregard your community, and that you don't disrespect your community, and your community is not just African American people, but your community is Black people across the world. Your community is Afro-Caribbeans and Africans on the continent and Afro-Latinos, that those are your people, even though they might not understand it, right? That was an evolving conversation. But rule number 1, you don't go out here on these streets and make your family look bad. So to be out in the streets sort of, bad mouthing where you come from and us bad mouthing each other, it's just poor form, it's tacky, and you don't see a lot of other people doing it. It's counterproductive, particularly for us if we're on the bottom. So just don't do it, right? It's just really coonish behavior, and I don't really like that word, but that's what it is, right? So the second thing too is strivers. Strivers all over the world have a way of thinking that assimilation is the answer to racism. And in some ways it is, right? That, you get a little bit of a reward, you get the job, and, you get to be the favorite Negro of the white people passing out their little rewards. But you make the wrong step, or when they're done and finished with you, you are discarded, right? So there's a saying that, white supremacy always breaks its tools. And I've seen this happen over and over and over again, right? And I think that for whatever reason, no one schools us on this, that ultimately in the end, it doesn't really benefit you to completely have no integrity as a Black person and sell yourself or other Black folks out, right? That you get these little rewards, but you were teaching yourself and everybody else around you that you just have no self-respect. So I just kind of think it's not worth it. But we all do it, right? Strivers to a certain degree. We do that. We know that's the game and what we have to do to survive or to thrive here. While we're doing that, we also have to be the hardest working and often the smartest people in the room, particularly those of us who have really kind of achieved things at a really higher level, right? Whether that's academically or in our workplaces, that we know that, we really have to work harder than anybody else. And the thing is that we're working really hard for people that reward us, but not in the ways that we should be rewarded. So we know that. But I think that Black folks bring a level of genius and creativity to the workplaces that people are amazed by, but undervalue and won't really give us credit for or reward us for. So with that being said, well, that's one thing, right? So I will say this to you about this stereotype of Africans not liking African Americans. And that might be true here in the US, and it's true because the Africans that come here often are from striving communities, right? And part of the assimilating for them sometimes is adopting white people's attitudes about us, right? And sometimes it's easy for them to do in their defense because we can be really ignorant, right? And rude and obnoxious about Africa and Africans. So why would anybody like you if you're disrespectful to their culture? Also, again, if they're getting rewards from white people and they literally are told when they immigrate here to stay away from us, because I have friends from Ethiopia and Eritrea and Nigeria and Ghana and Tanzania, Kenya, and a few other places who tell me that that's actually what they're told, when they get here, to stay away from us. Some of us actually need to stay away from. But that's the message they get, and it's reiterated for them to that they're different and that they're better, right? So that's what you get when you get here, right? You see that tension, that they're also trying to assimilate and to curry favor with white folks. So it has all of us at each other's throats, and it's stupid, right? It literally is us being family, being out here in these streets fighting each other over small rewards for people who really can't stand any of us. And the reason why I say that is because when you go to Africa and you start understanding some African politics, Africa gets this rap as being corrupt, right? And I'll say why that is during the 70s when you had a lot of leaders who were coming to place who were socialists, they were murdered and they were replaced by dictators. Sorry, I'm not recording this again because I'm 14 minutes in. But they were replaced by dictators, right? And they were dictators that were actually installed by the US or Europeans. And they would allow Europeans in the US to keep looting Africa of its resources and its money. So I don't know if you guys have heard of the Pact to End Colonization or the Pact to Continue Colonization that the French African countries have with France. All came out a couple of years ago when there was the big dispute with African migrants trying to get to Europe and they were allowed to drown in the ocean. They were also being sent back, and they were crossing through Italy because I think France wasn't letting them in, or France was pushing them back through Italy, something crazy like that, right? And the Italians were upset, and they were saying that this was France's fault, that these people were drowning in the sea, and that Africans should be in Africa, that they were leaving for better jobs and a better economic future because France was stealing all of their money. And the French and the Italians were fighting this out, right? Very publicly. And what the Italians were talking about was the French, when they left, right, when they supposedly ended colonization, which they didn't, they made their former colonies sign a pact that they would have all of their money printed in France, and that that money, also a certain amount of their money, would be deposited and held in French banks. And that if those countries wanted to borrow or use their own money, they were going to have to borrow their own money from France and borrow it at interest, right? So France was not just stealing their money, basically. They were giving their money to France. France was holding on to it and using it as they pleased. And when Africa wanted to use their own money, they had to pay to use their money, right? So it's thuggery, it's corruption, and they, come up with this law saying that, it's legal because, you signed this contract. But, it's just, again, destructive and thuggery and thievery. But, we know that's what we're dealing with, right? So anyway, with that being said, Africa's in the same boat, right? Where it's been exploited over and over again. And it makes sense because I'll just talk about the history right now real briefly, that the first thing that allowed for colonization was slavery. And what happened was the Europeans had to depopulate Africa in order to go in and conquer it. So it took, the conservative estimates are 50 million people out of Africa and displaced them all over the world, to 250 million Africans, right? That's a lot of people. And it took them hundreds of years to do it. And when they finally accomplished it, they were able to go in 1913 during the Berlin Conference and carve up Africa and decide what European countries were going to get, what African borders and empires, right? So these borders that you see in Africa now, they're all artificial. They're purposely sort of cut up, and it's led to tribalism and a lot of other things. But they did this in order to be able to rule, conquer, and implement slavery in Africa. So often, my African friends will say, well, we were never slaves. And it's not true. They just call it colonization. The people actually literally had to work for free. So what do you call that, right? And they were tortured just the same. So I was talking to my boyfriend about this, who's Tanzanian. And, he's told us that, how the older African people in his family, the older people in his family don't, have a hard time with white folks, don't really like white folks, because there was a time that they remember they literally had to work on these farms, and they showed white people how to farm. And the white folks would cut their arms off once they'd showed them how to farm. And that's another video, because these people didn't know how to farm. They didn't know how to do a lot of things, and we showed them. And once we did, they punished us for it, right? We thought that they were gonna reward us, or they were friendly to us, until it was clear that they didn't need us anymore. So then they punished us or hurt us. And that's kind of what happens over and over again. So anyway, just to say that, our cousins in Africa, literally our cousins in Africa, also have experienced slavery, and they continue to, just like we continue to experience oppression here. The thieving and stealing of our neighborhoods, like what's going to happen, I think, after this, after things settle down, that they're going to come in and they're going to take our property for pretty cheap, right? If the building is condemned, they're going to say, well, if you can't fix it up, the state is going to take it, and it's going to be our property now. And you're going to see Black people getting looted and stolen from once again. And that's kind of our nature of our relationship with these folks. So anyway, I say that to say that, we, being Black people who are in the most developed nation in the world, have skills and abilities, and we also have experience with these folks firsthand. So a lot of our African brothers and sisters, they're in the majority, and they've had generations to kind of forget what it's like to be under direct control of these folks. We haven't. But what's going on now is getting ready to be a second scramble for Africa. All the resources there, Africa is beautiful, it's warm, it's lush, it's the Garden of Eden. That's what I call it, particularly Tanzania. But every place I've ever been in Africa is just amazingly gorgeous, and there's food, and every known resource to man is there. And I'm going to say this too, and it's going to be strong language, but the nature of the people that oppress us is kind of parasitic. And everywhere they go, they use up all the resources, and they deplete everything until like there's really nothing left. It's kind of really a scorched earth kind of thing, and it's almost like they can't help themselves, but that's another story. But they've used up all the resources here, and they started wars with people in the Middle East to get that oil. We see what's happening down in Brazil with our brothers and sisters there. If you don't know, a lot of Black Brazilians are being allowed to die with COVID. And also that's almost intentional too, because they're sitting on lands that they want to develop. Even the Amazon right now, their fascist white supremacist leader in Brazil is in the process of plundering the Amazon. And we actually need that for environmental reasons. But you can't reason with people who worship money and revel in violence. And that's what we're facing. So when I tell people that, you got to think about having an exit strategy, it's because this is the nature of these folks. All of this might calm down, right? But it's going to calm down until they get comfortable again. And that tendency to abuse and take is going to rear its ugly head again, because this is a cycle, and this is just of who we're dealing with. And it gets worse every time. And again, it's just kind of genocidal. Like I wrote, all over the world, throughout history, this is just the nature of things. And when they're not doing it to us, they're doing it to each other. Read their history. It's just what happens. So I think those of us who understand that, it's in your best interest to get over, take a visit, go and see what it has to offer you. And then I also recommend a couple of YouTubers. So, there's YouTubers who are in Tanzania, people who've repatriated to Ghana and Nigeria and Senegal and the Gambia and a bunch of other places, South Africa. It's people that you can follow, and there's actually businesses and companies that will help you with repatriation, that will help you make investments and start businesses and buy property and maybe even buy land. There's lots of things that you can do. But start small, start with that visit, get over there, and maybe buy yourself a piece of land. Things are a lot cheaper than they are here. Get yourself a house, and think about it this way. It's a really nice, even if nothing goes completely crazy here, right? And God, I really hope that it doesn't. I don't have high hopes for it. But even if it doesn't, Africa's a wonderful place to retire. And the reason why is because, a place like Tanzania, you can live really well off of $1,000 a month, right? Like you can have a house and a driver and a maid, lots of property and beautiful land. And you don't have a mortgage to pay for. And if you have retirement and Social Security coming in, you can live pretty well. I mean, really, really well. And you're not, under the pressure of people who treat you like criminal children. So I remember the first time I was in Ghana, and I went with my friend, and we would go into stores, and, people were rushing to service. And it wasn't because they thought we were going to steal anything, but it was because they were treating us like honored guests. And I had never felt that before. And I was sad for myself, and then really happy to experience it. It was weird. That's a whole nother story. I'm going to talk about that, I know, in another video, right? About what it feels like to be on the continent. But for now, just get yourself a visit, go over, think about it, and do this for your kids. Most of you have children, you have families, and you love them, and you're especially your sons. They deserve better than to be in a place like this. Even if they're getting older and they're in college now, if you start establishing a place there for yourself, if it gets hot here, there's a place of retreat for your sons to go, because they're not allowed to be full functional men here, right? Without somebody wanting to take their lives. So anyway, fam, I will be back. Love you guys, and please be safe and take care.